Welcome to episode 50 of Researching Happy. I am Dr. Matthew Iasiello, and if you work or are passionate about mental health promotion, this is the show for you. Researching Happy is about critical conversations about wellbeing promotion, positive psychology, and the multidisciplinary wellbeing science in a casual conversational format with experts from around the world. So far, we've had positive psychologists, sociologists, neuroscientists, clinical psychologists, economists, philosophers, theologians, epidemiologists, coaches, architects, human rights advocates, and so on. Today, we're celebrating episode 50 with something special, a debate entitled, Are We Lying to Ourselves in Positive Psychology? So if you're new to the show, please consider subscribing wherever you're watching and join the mailing list at researchinghappy.com. Now to our guests. I'm holding one of your books each. So I've got some skin in the game, and will you please introduce yourselves? So can we get a brief summary of who you are, the work that you do, and why you're passionate about your work? Maybe we'll start with you, Todd.
Yeah, great to be here. My favorite young scholar, my favorite philosophical well-being expert. I'm a professor of psychology at George Mason University. I founded the Wellbeing Laboratory before well-being was cool back in 1999. And we study, my team, pretty much everything you want to be talking about at a party. Friendship, romance, sex, psychological flexibility, curiosity, creativity, social anxiety, stress, resilience, courage, purpose, and meaning in life. Our goal is to create more solid empirical foundations for the things you can do to move the needle in people's lives.
Beautiful. Thank you, Todd. And on to you, Eri.
Awesome. Thanks for the invite, Matt. And great to be here with Todd and you together. My name is Eri Mountbatten-O'Malley. I've been working at Bath Spa University since 2021, so about 4 years, something like that. I was at Edge Hill University where I did my PhD in human flourishing, conceptual analysis of human flourishing. So it's recently been published with Bloomsbury, as you flashed up earlier. Thank you. So that's my great little plug. So essentially, that's my academic period. Really, I'm very much an early scholar, even though I don't look very young. But I'm really early in my journey, if you like. Like the PhD was only published in 22, something like that, and the book was last year. So very, very young scholar, I would say, or early scholar anyway. Before that, I did a lot of work in social policy research. I was doing empirical research. I was analyzing the problems with government policies, particularly in the context of social welfare reform. So probably in the States, you had a similar austerity package politically, where governments are expected to tighten their belts and their spending. And so basically that was affecting a lot of the social spending for disabled groups, vulnerable groups, all of that. And so I was really sort of cataloging the impact of the changes the impact on those groups, on those vulnerable groups. So that was my kind of sort of pre-academic bit, and then my academic bit. And recently, I've started up a social enterprise called Flourish Cafe, where I effectively help communities to think about flourishing on their own terms. So that's a sort of little snapshot for me.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you. I enjoy watching what happens at Flourish Cafe.
Mm.
And I think Todd, yeah, this is probably part of the conversation, but Eri, you've been on the show before, and I think you told this really cool story, I think, which probably I know will resonate with Todd, which is that, you almost started a different PhD, or you did even start a different PhD on school well-being, right? And then you started looking at what happens in well-being in schools, and you thought, wait a minute, we pumped the brakes, basically. I can't start this unless we've got the philosophy solid. And then you did a philosophy PhD
Interesting.
instead.
Yeah, it was kind of, you almost right. I mean, basically, I started in the Faculty of Health at Edge Hill, and so there was a health orientation to my PhD, but it was supposed to be like a hybrid. So it was like philosophically informed empirical research, which is actually a really good idea. But not when you've got so many problems with the concept like flourishing, like identified in the literature. So it took me almost a year, I would say, or it took me a good 6 months plus anyway to realize that. And then at that point, I basically had to put in a request to change the whole project because they were funding it. Obviously, so I had a funded PhD. It wasn't a self-funded. So I had to get approval for that, and that was very complex and difficult, um, because there are established kind of uh, agendas and so on. So they really wanted this within the kind of public health bracket. But like I said, I just couldn't see sense in just adding another theoretical construct to the mess of ideas out there. So I just thought, no, I'm not going to do that, even though that's what they were really egging me on to do. But yeah, no, I mean, I really wanted to provide clarity, I suppose, as opposed to contributing to the mess. So that was really why I embarked on my PhD, and it was as much a self journey as it was I don't mean to be cheesy, but it was as much that as it was a kind of philosophical analysis and research project. It was
Mhm.
also me digging into the ideas and working with the material to try to figure out, on a really deep existential sense, what's going on here. Yeah,
Very cool.
yeah. I'm going to turn my other light on because it's getting a bit dark here.
Go for it. Go for it. Yeah, we're battling tech issues. We're battling time zone differences. So this is all cool. I
That's a bit
appreciate
better.
you both being here. So what we're going to do for the format is basically do sort of opening statements. I mean, I think that you probably both agree more than you disagree, to be honest. So we're going to do opening statements where you can each sort of open up with some challenges about positive psychology, and the other two can counterpoint and sort of basically discuss. Then we'll move into a bit of synthesis. So, sort of seeing where there's common ground, discussing where our critiques converge and maybe where they complement each other, and then turning our attention to sort of future directions and what we think we can do going forward. So, Eri, would you like to kick us off? I think you've both had very fair critiques of positive psychology, or of maybe the conduct in the field. Maybe Eri, if you want to kick us off with some of the things that you've seen, that you'd like to see probably improved, and we can go from there. So Todd,
Yeah,
if
cool.
we'll give you like sort of 5 minutes, we won't say anything. I know that's hard sometimes, and then we can jump in. If I can control Todd at all, that's
You're going to see my clinical psychology skills in place right now.
okay. Eri, let's hear it.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that we have to ask in positive psychology, probably in any research endeavor, is what's the point? What are we doing? So if we want to improve well-being, then I think that is a noble aim. If we want to improve public health, if we want to improve, for example, the experience in schools, if we want more cohesive communities, if we want people to thrive, these are all really, really noble aims, and these are aims that every government and corporation and anyone in a leadership position should have, really. But I think, you have to look at actually what is actually happening in the research field and what is the impact of it. And I think from my perspective, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of huff and puff, and there's not a lot of impact. There's not a lot of change. There's not a lot of really what it's supposed to be doing, what this kind of research is supposed to be doing, which is changing lives. It's supposed to be changing societies, changing businesses, for the better. So my provocation really is, is there any point to the research that is going on in a lot of positive psychology at the moment? Yeah, I don't think there is. So that's my that's my provocation.
Okay,
Is
and
that all right, or do you want more? Do you want more detail? I don't know, but that's my
Well,
that's my kind of slogan. But if you want some more detail, I can give it.
no, that's good. Let me play with that for a second. Let me get concrete. I'm going to do something different here. I have written so many critiques about this field. I'm going to do a little bit of defense about well-being science here. So let's go with this bumper sticker that one of the beauties of the field that often leads to critiques of the field is the idea that we don't know the mechanisms for why things work. We need to know some theoretical framework, philosophical framework before we get there. I'm going to argue that sometimes effectiveness of an intervention often precedes understanding and explanations. And that's a beautiful thing. And the way that I like to think about this is imagine that you mentioned kind of, schools and you almost got a PhD in educational school psychology. You've got a bunch of kids that are drowning in school-related stress. You got a bunch of kids that are having difficulties with bullying and not forming friendships. You've got a bunch of military veterans that are coming home, entering civilian life. And for 1 second, one chapter of their lives, they're hyper vigilant and worried about life or death. And then the next stage of their life, they're focusing on making sure that they take out the recyclables on Tuesdays and Thursdays and pick out cereals with low levels of sugar when they're in the supermarket. And the question is, do we say to these kids that are suffering, do we say to these soldiers who did these heroic patriotic deeds and come back to civilian life and say, you know what? We got nothing for you yet because we have not mapped out the neurophysiology of joy yet. And until we do that, we don't have anything for you to increase your sense of joy. So just hang on, wait a decade, let us get down the phenomenology, the behavioral correlates, the neurophysiology of it, do a randomized clinical trial, and you just suffer in peace as you wait. And I think there's something to be said about just getting some damn questions asked and tested. And you can build bottom up in that way, just figuring out like what moves the needle on someone that's a bully survivor and someone's a military veteran at just civilian life, and what doesn't, and start from there. And other times you can go from theories and kind of play around with them and go top down.
Yeah. Yeah. Can I respond briefly, Matt?
Absolutely. There are no
Yeah.
rules here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I 100% agree, Todd. That is actually the ideal, to be honest, in my mind, is to come from the ground up. Um, I think that the problem that I'm picking with positive psychology, I mean, remember that positive psychology is a response, isn't it, to pathological, if you like, approaches to psychology, right? So it's a good response to a problem in research that was really, I'm sorry, in practice, in psychological practice, that was too heavily kind of focused and emphasized the the kind of the illness factor of mental health or whatever. So and there wasn't enough attention on actually building strengths-based approaches. Yeah, so it's things that actually will nurture and make you more resilient and stronger and able to cope with the various vicissitudes of life and the challenges that you have. So the aims are good. That's what I mean. I think the aims are good, and you're right. You don't need this upfront kind of laden. I mean, that's really what I have issue with is all of this upfront theoretical stuff. Um, because what you end up having in the research is effectively um, technicalized concepts that are backed up by theories. It becomes so divorced from actually just the ordinary bloke, in the street or lady or whatever, and their needs, their desires, their hopes, their dreams, their fears. It becomes so divorced from all of that. That's why I'm saying it's kind of pointless. Yeah, because it's only kind of for my mind. I mean, there is this value in intellectual thought for its own sake. There is value in academia. There is value in that, but it's not what is claiming to be. Positive psychology is claiming to be the if you like, the voice of balanced life, the voice of strengths, the voice of virtues in psychology, etc. But I don't think it is. I think it really is. It's in its own kind of echo chamber, and you have a lot of I think theoretical constructs, technicalizations that just completely divorces it from how ordinary people understand ordinary terms like happiness, flourishing, fulfillment, well-being, etc. And in that kind of technicalization process, that's I think is where the meaning is lost. And then it just becomes an academic game. It's just about
Right.
academics debating amongst themselves, toying and competing over different ideas. But that's fine. But then let's label it as that. Let's not then claim to be this transformative paradigm that's going to change society and bring wellness to workplaces and schools and all. It's not doing that, and it can't do it because it's so divorced from reality.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
This is getting good already. I'm very pleased. And like to jump in, the point I guess of this conversation is that those debates don't even happen. So I guess to
Correct.
further to add on to build on what you're saying, Eri, like that siloed approach I think happens within at the level of researchers' own careers. So there's just researchers just carry on with what they do. Other people have different approaches, and never the two shall meet, basically. Even we have conferences, but we don't talk about these sort of conflicts. We don't jump into these things. So I think it's maybe even more pronounced than what you're saying. The other thing that came up for me there
Mm.
is everyone maybe builds their own idea up of what is positive psychology, and people have quite
Mm.
different experiences. I think that someone like yourself, Todd, that was kind of there from the early days and has watched it, and sort of the key personalities at a personal level, them and you've watched as this thing's grown. Others sort of are arriving now, and how do you orient yourself and how do you figure out what pos psych is? Because there's a lot of promises out there from different people.
Yeah, so there's nothing but if there's video with this podcast, all you're gonna see me is nodding my head to everything I'm already saying. So let me offer a bright spot, another concrete point to kind of bring home where I want to add here. Um, Stanford University. This is a study that I cited in the book that you held earlier. Jeffrey Cohen, Greg Walton, not names in the positive psychology world, and they did a study and they asked themselves, okay, we know we had this racial minority black-white effect in terms of performance in schools, especially in early grade schools. So before you get to even 15, 16, 17 years of age. So you're looking like 10 to 14. So you get this 15-point IQ difference. Maybe it's dropped down to 12. There's some arguments in the sociology literature, but there's a gap. There's definitely a black-white achievement gap for kids. And what they wanted to know was, just as Ari is saying, is like, how do we freaking plug the gap? And so they tested this thing out where they said, what if teachers gave feedback in two particular ways? One is when you hand in a paper, I write down all the things you did positively, all the things you did negatively, and just be very kind of like honest and candid about that, and you get your grade. And then in the other condition, you get just an additional mention of, I've seen you in class. I know you can do better than this. And that's it. That's the difference. Those are the two conditions. Call it a affirmation condition, call it a self-affirmation condition, call it a ego enhancement condition. Doesn't matter what you call it. I just described what actually happens in the real world. And what they found was that these kids responded extremely well. It's like, oh, you see an ideal version of myself that is greater than my present self. And they perform better in two different ways. One was they were more likely to take up the option to revise that paper for a better grade. That is exactly what you want as a teacher and as a parent and as anyone.
Mm.
Two, they did better. So
Mm.
this is on average what happens there. Here's the thing.
Yeah.
Do we know the mechanisms? Not really. Again, effectiveness precedes understanding and explanations. Does it match the real world? Absolutely. Where is the problem here is that these whole body of researchers, Greg Walton, Jeffrey, in at Stanford, they're not considered well-being science. They're considered social psychologists. So this very weird siloing things happen. And people like myself who maybe have been here for a few decades can see of grab from that tree and say, nope, that's well-being science. But when you hear people who are in doing their TED Talks, writing their books, writing reviews, writing a journal of positive psychology, writing a journal of happy studies, they're not referencing that study. So when they do a study, they say, hey, I created this new thing, this self-compassion intervention for kids in schools, make no reference to this great body of work that already exists. And this is what Ari is saying, and I'm completely agreeing, is like, is the entire pool of knowledge that relates to the enhancement of personal and societal adaptive outcomes is well-being science. And when you take a slice of that only arbitrarily because of names, because of construct terms, you, to me, are a weaker scientist and a weaker thinking because you're letting the heroic nature, you're letting the guru nature, you're letting terminology tell you which places to go to, where to search for knowledge. And I'm saying there is a massive pool of knowledge, but it doesn't have the keywords you're looking for. And so you're going to have to do a little bit of work to find them.
Mhm.
So the field is actually much more mature than we actually believe. And I get very
Yeah.
frustrated when people tell me it's only a
Mm.
new field. It's only been around for, for 27 years. And I'm like, no, because
No.
once I start grabbing from economics and from philosophy and
Yeah.
sociology and from over here in social psychology, it's like this stuff's been going on for decades, for over 50, 60 years now.
Yeah, I mean, positive psych really is rooted out of the humanistic movement, isn't it? So, it came out of that kind of recognition of strengths, the need to think about strengths, the need to think about human strengths, but it wanted to turn that into a science. And I think I know this is your bag, Todd, but I think this is actually part of the flaw in the whole research paradigm, is because it's the urge to turn something into a hard science, to reflect the hard sciences, is I think that's where a lot of the researchers go wrong, and the human gets lost in the process. It's great that you gave that, for example, that anecdote about a teacher's intervention that, that was cited in a social psychology paper or whatever, but um, you know, that happens all the time. I mean, that's not such a great thing. It's not such a mind-blowing intervention to encourage a child who's feeling like they've got low self-esteem. You don't need a paper to tell you that. You just need to have human sensitivity. You know, it, it,
This is
it
this is where we're going to disagree on this one. But go on.
yeah, well, that's fine. But I mean, a lot of the churn in the literature is just it feels like everything has to be scientifically validated. No, it doesn't. You don't need scientific validation for everything. What you do need, I think, is humanistic values. You need some values that respect the human being, the dignity that's in front of you, the group that you're researching, whatever it might be. But you don't need science to tell you that, oh, children respond well to encouragement. I mean, come on, this is daft, isn't it?
So this is a common criticism of psychology writ large, much less well-being science. So I
Okay.
take umbrage with this because what the only way you can critique it is you take the complexity that I described and you break it down to one term, right? So we'll just like it's your kids, teachers should be kind to their kids, adults should be kind to kids, they do better in school. No, it's very specific. It's this is what they call this a wise psychological intervention. Cheap, specific, tied to very clear rationale, and then you're able to kind of move the needle on something important. So it's not just being nice to the kid, it's that you are actually showing through a behavioral expression in the written word. So there's nothing to debate. You can't say, well, they don't really think that about me. Well, no, because it's written down on the piece of paper. So that already we're moving away from just encouragement. You have behavioral evidence that the kid gets to see, and as that kid argues with their parent, that teacher doesn't really believe that. No, no, no. Let's read it again. Look at the way that you said it. I'm going to say that now in their voice. That happens there. The second part of this is they are seeing a vision of them that they may not see, the gap between present self and ideal self. So that's
Yeah.
not, so I don't, so I wouldn't, I think it's a mistake to just put this under encouragement. And the same mistake happens when people just shove stuff under this silo called emotional intelligence. And I've always been a big, you know, very argumentative about this point is one of the problems with this globular term called emotional intelligence is it's the molecular details that matter. So if it ends up being that Matt and I have extreme different political views about abortion. We'll just take a super polarizing, difficult issue right from the bat. And the thing is, and this Robert Biswas Dieter writes about this in his book Radicalistic. Is there a place where I can actually, because I care about Matt as a human being, I am able to listen and try to understand where he developed that idea, no responsibility whatsoever to agree with him whatsoever or change my view in the slightest, not even 10%. But just because I want to understand something that's important to me, like why is this important to you? Why is this particular viewpoint that's the opposite of mine important to you? Now we could say that's all just display of emotional intelligence. You don't need science to talk about like to be curious about someone else is a way to diffuse political polarization. But we right now have a paper under review at Nature Scientific Reviews, 3 studies of showing that getting people to be curious about the gap between their perspective and someone else's perspective, to try to understand it, but not to try to agree with it, is actually reduces your desire to be socially distant from someone who has opposing views to you, and reduces hostility and increases your interest in understanding other parts of themselves besides their political views. Now, I think it would be a mistake to say, you're just talking about people being kind. You're just talking about people that are good listeners. You're just talking about people that are just good citizens who are emotionally intelligent. No, it's the very specific thing that I said.
Yeah, and I guess like just building on that, the idea that in practice there will be teachers who will be maybe taking both of those approaches that study outlined, both say in the name of kindness, and so there is value in the sense of I guess in a positivist way of knowing, right, that there is a marked difference of one approach over the other. I think I agree with you, Eri. Like a lot of the topics on this show, and one whole episode was focused on scientism, this belief that basically I don't believe it until there's a scientific paper.
Yeah.
That's at
Yeah.
play too, right? And maybe it's that you're responding to.
Yes. Yeah. So that's in the background is this kind of positivism, and that leads to scientism. It's this kind of like the only knowledge that's worth having is scientifically measurable knowledge. And that becomes a kind of ideological construct. Actually, it becomes very ideological, and people will die in the battlefield over that sometimes. So it becomes very polarizing, just that as a kind of worldview and a fundamental belief. But just to respond to Todd there, yeah, I didn't mean to straw man, and reduce it down to encouragement, and make kind of oversimplify it. I was obviously just, throwing out an anecdote. No, obviously there's a lot that goes on in the relationship between the teacher and the pupil, a good, healthy relationship, or a mentoring relationship, a relationship of mutual respect, a relationship of mutual understanding and knowledge, of acknowledgement, all those different things. So there are things that don't work as well. So this is
Right.
where, research is kind of useful, is maybe if you have a bad practice where teachers think that they're doing something good, you know what I mean? By doing
Yes.
something, and it's doing a harm instead. So those areas, that's a more interesting area. And it's like, right, okay, so there tends to be this teaching practice. Teachers have been trained years ago in the 70s or 80s or whatever. They think they're doing this really well because they're trained under an old model. And actually, research shows that, I don't know, Generation X or whatever kids don't respond to that style of teaching or that kind of empathy or that kind of encouragement, whatever it is. So yeah, I think I didn't mean to kind of poo-poo it all, but I just wanted to give you an example of where I think, you know, sometimes there is this tendency to just want to, research absolutely everything, and it is only valuable if it's under the scientific paradigm. But if we go to your you gave an example there of self-efficacy. If we think about the two things I want to say about that. So firstly, Seligman started off, didn't he, with the learned helplessness thing, which is, I think that was his PhD. But anyway, so he started off with, looking at the behavior of dogs to see if they would jump over this gate, if they were electrocuted, would they jump? And if you eventually left the gate, if you left the gate open, and you electrocuted them, would they still jump after having kind of learnt that jumping doesn't make a difference? They get electrocuted on both sides, basically. So the dogs learned helplessness. So then he translated that obviously to the human realm and suggesting that actually, well, we can learn helplessness. Well, actually, we can also learn helpfulness or helpfulness. Yeah, I don't know. Learning how to help ourselves, basically. So, so research like that, dubious, ethically dubious anyway, can lead to some insights, can lead to some human insights, and it can have some value, right? But I did as part of my book, it was very important to think about these sorts of issues in the context of positive psychology and what helps, what brings you forward towards a flourishing life. This is what I was concerned about. And what are the barriers? What are your barriers? And you know, you can do a kind of qualitative study and go out and ask people, well, what are the barriers to flourishing? You can do that type of thing, or you can do a quantitative one as well, to have another stream of data. But I can analyze this, from my armchair, and I'm on purpose, I'm using the word armchair there because, of course, philosophers are criticized for sitting in their armchairs and philosophizing. But I can literally just think here and think about the problems of my self-concept, for example. If I unpack why, for example, I might have some beliefs about I don't know, like maybe I think I can't row. We were talking earlier about the rowing that I was doing tonight. It was like maybe for some reason, I was a child I fell in the river as a child, and I just got traumatized by it, and now I just got this belief I can't row. Right, okay, well, obviously that belief is going to stop us from getting into rowing, well, potentially at least going to stop us for engaging with that sort of activity because there's like a fear response that's associated with it, right? Okay, and so what I've done there in my kind of analysis is I've realized actually that what's going on, it's not just a psychological issue. It's not just like, me dealing with trauma, but actually there is a philosophical issue at the heart of this, which is the conception of myself. This is a philosophical issue. It's not psychological per se. It's a philosophical issue. So what I mean by that is that I have a concept of myself, for example. I'm Eri, I'm this academic, I've got this life, I brought up in London, traveled a lot, I don't know, like wine on occasions, like a good sunset, like to be, bold sometimes, whatever. My sorts of likes and dislikes. This is what I've got in my head. This is my kind of like vision of myself. If something were to challenge that, then that's where you can fail to grow through your own kind of self-concept. So you have these self-limiting beliefs. So you can draw on psychological research for that if you like, but if you have a philosophical understanding of what it means to have a self-concept, you can do all of that without any of that. What you need really is just good thinking skills. And then you can figure out, yeah, actually, I've got a problematic self-concept that I need to work on, and I'm thinking about these things. So there's a very fine line here between the philosophical aspect and the psychological aspect. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, you know, you you don't need science to tell you these things. You just need good thinking skills, and you need good values. That's what you need. And okay, if you have some problematic issues in a classroom or in any environment, that needs research, fine. Some problems, fine. But all the well-being kind of like explosion of well-being research, this is why, this is what I think it's really reductive. We're very
Can
complex,
I can I push
very
back
complex group.
can I push back on this one? Um, so I think about 2040, World Health Organization has it set where depression will be the leading cause of disability in the world. So cancer, heart disease, HIV, AIDS, stroke, infarcts, nothing's coming close to depression. So with this number of people in the population, cross cultures that experience the condition, we start to have to ask some different difficult questions, which is what is an effective way to scale the simplest interventions possible that could have the greatest impact? And so you're already nodding your head.
Because I think because this is part of the churn that I was talking about earlier, where we kind of have, think about politics. I know this is perhaps a bad analogy, but think about the politics since the 90s, right? Since Clinton and Blair and others, right? All we've done is done interventions in foreign nations constantly. Foreign interventions. Have any of them worked out? I don't think there's one. Okay. So we have a kind of interventionist mindset that there's a problem there. We've got to intervene. We've got to do something. No, no, we don't. We often don't have to do something as an intervention. What we need to do is stop doing the things that are causing harm. For example,
But all right, you sound like the great grandfather that's yelling at clouds and yelling at their kids, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
No, no, no.
What
No,
I
no,
was
let me finish
about
my,
to
no, but
Hang on, hang on.
you need to let me finish my point. So, for example, all right, so and this is part of the malaise in well-being science, is the kind of tendency towards instrumentalism and uh, um, couched in the kind of neoliberal malaise that we're in at the moment, right? So here's an example. So I knew a school teacher who had very bad well-being, and the manager sent a survey to all the staff and asked them about their well-being. It was overwhelmingly bad, as it is for many teachers, because they've got very high pressure roles, with a lot of bureaucracy and so on, as well as all the needs and to look after the children, which is itself very stressful. So anyway, so teaching is a difficult, stressful role, even though it's really, really rewarding. It's very stressful in the current circumstances. So rather than addressing the need for tackling overworked teachers or under-supported teachers, which is really what's going on there, rather than addressing that, the teacher sent everyone on a resilience course. Yeah. And this is what I mean. This is the type of thinking that's right. Okay. You're not very resilient now. Right. We need to get you on a resilience course. That's the intervention. Yeah. And it's not just me. There are others that have critiqued all of the sort of positive psychology interventions. The problem is they're quite instrumental. They fail to deal with the underlying issues. I mean, Sarah Willen has recently published on this, and we did a kind of podcast thing together. Actually, it was a discussion for the Justice for Flourishing group, which is part of the Harvard Flourishing Community Practice Program. But anyway, so she's written about this. The problem is that the structural systemic issues are not being addressed. They're the causes of lack of well-being. That's the underlying issue with well-being issue. Is that actually we have poor circumstances of living for a lot of people in our society, but the kind of well-being science approach is right. Okay, what's going to be the intervention that's going to help this group to feel better? Or often it is interpreted that way. It might not. I'm not suggesting that you design interventions or research interventions in that way, but you have the way that the research is churned out. It is interpreted by policymakers, by corporations, all those sorts of people that are doing the work on the ground. It's interpreted in this very instrumental way because of the kind of positivist, my instrumentalist mindset. Am I making sense?
You are, but we're mixing a lot of things together. Let me come at this from a different angle so that because I feel like I got cut off quickly. Let's start with basic research, basic theory. So most people know about the marshmallow study, right? So no interventions whatsoever. Basically, go into a room, little kid, 5-year-old kid, you get a marshmallow, say, hey, if you can wait 5 minutes, actually, you're not giving it time. If you can wait till I get back, I'll give you a second marshmallow. And it's basically a behavioral measure of self-control. And what you find is those kids that can resist eating the marshmallow, they have better grades, they're more likely to make friends, they're more likely to be employed, less likely to be divorced, more likely to be married, have greater life longevity, recover back quicker from illnesses, blah, blah, blah. About 10 years ago, you had a study that challenged those initial findings. No interventions, just a research study, which basically said, you know what? One of the problems of that initial study was you had a very homogeneous population. And just like you're talking about people from different social strata in the world, they found that, you know what? When you actually have a sample with a subsample people from opportunity poor environments, a la poverty, or opportunity rich environments, which is they have a structural system where they're exposed to lots of rewards, that those kids from opportunity poor environments, they eat the marshmallow quicker. Guess what? It's because the environment basically like molded what behavior will allow you to adapt to a system of scarcity is eat the damn marshmallow. Like don't wait for the second one because the second one's not going to come. That happens there. So we understand person environment. Now, just last week, as of the recording of this podcast, Royal Academy of Science just published another study challenging the first two studies, which is basically is that if a kid in this marshmallow study has a second kid with them and they make a pact to agree that they're not going to eat the marshmallow, guess what happens? Whether you're to an opportunity rich or opportunity poor environment, guess what happens? You don't eat the marshmallow. So there's very interesting mechanisms here that raise all sorts of interesting ideas to consider about how do we intervene for people that are in environments that might be high quality and might be low quality. So we're talking about individuals and environments. Is that ends up being is that if you have a public commitment to another human being, even with children, so we can't, so going back to the same thing, I'm not going to say they've got social support. No, very specific. Publicly saying to another person, I'm going to do this thing. You're going to do this thing. We're going to do this thing together. Shared brains, shared operation that happens there. Now, this raises all sorts of questions that have just was last week. This was published. All sorts of questions I would love scientists to be having, convening in their labs together. Not policymakers yet, not organizations. I agree. Rush to market, to look to make money, to get status, to get power. Forget all that. I'm totally on board with all that. What I'm saying is people should be asking themselves, with this knowledge that you have a moderating effect of what was the environment that you were brought up in, there is a moderating effect of whether there is a true ally, behaviorally defined, who's going to be with you through this challenging process here. What can we do with this knowledge now to do something? Start now, because like I said before, if somebody is drowning because they have abusive, neglectful, problematic parents, they're in an environment where it is a less than 50% chance you're going to graduate high school from the place that you live. 10% chance you're not going to even survive till you're 13 years of age. I don't want you waiting until you master like all the mechanisms and mediators and moderators and replicate this 3 times, pre-register the findings. I want you to start trying and experimenting with stuff now. So if that's considered scientism in this model, I'd say I'm pro-scientism.
So to jump in, I think we're getting somewhere really good, and like I'm just throwing the sort of initial format out the window because this is just amazing. But I can hear it's a perfect example because I can hear both sides of this argument in that example. I can imagine, if we're suggesting that from Eri's perspective, you can see that this famous marshmallow study comes out. When was it? Did you say in the 80s, Todd?
The second one was in actually, I think the 2000s.
Okay, the first one though?
First one was in the 60s.
60s, right. So since the 60s, this famous study has come out. You can say it's sort of like a reductionistic interpretation that there's this one intervention about marshmallows, and we've kind of just running off into the distance with this. And there's this whole machine who's churned out ideas and policies, and we've told stories about it. But it was flawed, or there was a flaw, or there was a weakness in the design from the beginning.
Right.
Now, it's taken 40 years, or it took 20 years and then another 30 years, or whatever the timelines are, to actually test some of those ideas. And then we realize, oh, there's much more to the story. So that's where I guess if I'm understanding correctly, that's Eri's side of the argument, which is that we could have actually arrived at some of that complexity much earlier had we stopped and thought about these things and integrated potentially psychology with philosophy, with some of these ideas. So I think if I'm understanding your perspective, Eri, you're basically saying from the context of positive psychology, we could have actually sped up a lot if rather than we all just ran off our own race, if we just kind of stopped and thought and take stock of where we're at in a multidisciplinary way, we'd actually be much further ahead than what we are. But
slow thinking, just slow thinking, slow thinking, which is philosophical thinking, allowing that space. But that doesn't fit well with the kind of research agendas or, employment agenda.
Wait. Can we all just pause for a second?
There's a but on that. Yeah. Tell me, Todd.
All right. We've divorced this from the historical concept, the historical context of when Walter Mischel did the study in the 60s. In the 60s, a bunch of Aries all held the belief at the time, philosophers, sociologists, psychologists, was that self-control is not a malleable trait. Either you're born with it or you're not. And so this study was heresy at the time. So divorce that context, and all of a sudden it sounds like it was one person was seeking the spotlight, was not talking to other people, not thinking slowly for doing this. No, this was a brave scientist at the time. And so we have to be very careful to really see things, and it's really easy to step on a beautiful Eiffel Tower of Lego blocks. It's really hard to create one and mix it with a farmer set and a Mars Lego set and create something new and beautiful. When Martha Michelle first came out with that study, people were like, wait, you can modify this thing? Like and that was the start, like of, a bad trail of research that didn't replicate in terms of self-control and, Roy Baumeister's ego depletion model. It also led to some good research and bad research on conscientiousness and personality change and grit. Again, good, bad, and the ugly, all those things. But it all starts with, one character who's got that principle insubordination against the historical context of the time.
Yeah. And I guess that's the but for me is that so all the things that I just said, not necessarily but, and novel insight comes from these things. So when it comes to positive psychology, is your principal concern, Eri, then that machine, that mechanism of churning stuff out is just too big, too strong, and too fast? Because in defense of resilience training, obviously we do a lot of that work. I hear an implementation issue. It's not suggesting like, because I think people are very happy to say workplace well-being interventions don't work, school-based things don't work. When it's like, well, we rely on these same skills in clinical psychology and we see that it works in clinical psychology, it's an implementation issue in my mind. And we're all going to agree that these are often implemented in terrible ways. Like you say, I heard we did some work in a hospital where, in the context of COVID, staff were having to spend 15 minutes taking on and then another 15 minutes taking off all their protective stuff. And then they were getting told by their EAP, oh, if you're stressed, you should go for a walk. It's like, well, I've got a 5-minute break. It takes me 30 minutes to get in and out of the building, go and, dot, dot, dot. So implementation, I think, is another element that's totally missing when it comes to applying
Yeah.
and translating pos psych stuff. So where do we sit now? Where does this? Any comments from yourself, Eri, or yourself, Todd, onto that?
I agree with, Ari on this one. You just have to go on LinkedIn and just look at the number of people talking about well-being interventions in the workplace. And once you say, hey, can you open the black box and show me what are you doing and what Ari was saying and what's the rationale for it? And they say, well, gratitude's good, self-compassion's good, curiosity is good. I'm just gonna mix them all together into like stone soup and shove it to a bunch of people and spend a lot of dollars. And to Ari's point, to me, the question that when I see this and everyone's disingenuously like agreeing with everyone, this is all amazing. My first response is probably similar to Ari's, which is before you do that, you probably have a limited amount of budget. What's going to be the thing that moves the needle? Is it going to be about having a better maternity and paternity policy so that you can make sure that you can actually fit in some time to actually spend time with your kids, the next generation, make sure that they are emotionally functional as you as well, because that's why you had a kid in the first place, to spend time with them? Is that going to actually move the needle more than all of these pause psychology strengths put together? I would argue, I'd bet $1,000 that you're going to get more out of it for just doing that. Or and these offshoot workshops, 2, 3 day workshops, is it a team building exercise, or do you actually expect people to be that when they face like these unmanageable like adversities in their lives, do you think like 3 days is going to train you to handle like to be ostracized and ghosted by the team that you work with on a daily basis, where everyone, when you walk in, people stop talking and they share the ideas when you're not in the room and don't share the ideas when you're in the room? I can almost guarantee you with another $1,000 that that is going to be the thing that you want to be working on, is how do we reduce the level of ostracism and negative valuation, rejection is going to far surpass any resilience intervention that you can work with. Check out your team dynamics. As Ari is saying, like think slowly and look at like how is the power structure impacting people, where people are being left on the perimeter who have great ideas that'll never be shared with the group. And as a result, the group has lots of promise, but nothing's actually coming to fruition.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can see some convergence here. I think you know that it's important not to misunderstand what I'm saying, which is, I'm not characterizing all the work that goes on in positive psychology as pointless. That it's just that a lot of it, we just need to look at, the influence of, Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi, the early pioneers, and how it's been rolled out across the whole self-help industry and, every coaches and the whole churn there, which is easy to criticize. So there's no point in doing that. But, the thing is, it's just that, yes, it is a beast that has, in a way, become so big and so, um, influential, over public policy and corporations in particular, but also increasingly in education and schools, because you've got the whole positive education movement that's quite strong, really. Certainly in the alternative, but also in the mainstream increasingly. Because of the influence and the way that they've watered down a lot. The original part. So Seligman actually, Csikszentmihalyi is a rich thinker. I think very humanistic actually in his orientation. Seligman is a positivist, but his stuff is, and I'm not a fan of his writing, it's super theoretical, but you know, his account of, positive psychology is a lot richer than we see in, you know, rolled out across, the way it's kind of like proliferated, so it does get kind of watered down, and I think a lot of it's just to do with maybe the research habits in academia where you just take someone's idea or concept and then you just apply it. Do you know, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You take someone's idea off of one shelf and then you apply it here. And it's like, right, this easy, I can move it. But what I'm suggesting is that that is exactly because of the kind of positivist paradigm that's underpinning it all, because that's how reality is fixed. If you're a positivist, you think that things are in discrete blocks, that things are fixed, that they are measurable, and that once you've got yourself a theoretical construct and you've got some data on it, great, it's fixed. We just have to move that here. But as you were suggesting, Todd, it's all that, the devil is in the detail. It's all in that nuance. It's all in the context. And the kind of the superficiality of the way that these terms are used in the research, it completely masks all of that rich human context. And so that's my worry, is it really contributing positively in the world? Is it really? I don't know. I'm not 100% sure. I haven't been a victim of positive psychology, but I'm sure there are victims out there. There are children being measured on their character strengths. Maybe that's kind of unethical. There are policies that are being designed, with Seligman's work and others in mind. Um, well-being interventions in public health settings or community health settings and all sorts of, and there are people being harmed at the other end of that. So we've got to think about both the kind of epistemological issues, but also the ethical issues, and that it's complex. It's
Yeah.
very complex, but I think the problem with positive psych is it's often kind of superficial and reductive, basically.
Yeah. And look, I think we're getting on some really interesting ground, which is again, I guess maybe where we started. What is pos psych? Where do you draw the line? Because I think if you're looking maybe from an academic perspective, there's a very different experience potentially compared to that, like the world, the ecosystem of pos psych, right? And I think I'm agreeing with what you're saying, Eri, but I also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, basically,
Yeah,
because
no, I
I see
agree.
this again, like, there's a PhD, I think he's and it doesn't matter. There's someone in the UK who wrote this big review on well-being interventions and why they don't work in the workplace. William Fleming, I believe is his name. And I strongly disagree basically with the findings. And I think he's actually quite balanced in the paper where he's basically saying, well-being intervention is defined very loosely from the papers that I've got here. But that doesn't really matter because it makes headlines around the world. And even in Australia, it made a huge headline of like, we're throwing all this money in the bin. Now we are throwing money in the bin, that's for sure. But the types of interventions I think that we deliver now, and I'm going to sound self-interested here, so I'm just declaring that, but we deliver, I think, really rigorously designed, tested interventions that do make a difference for well-being. Now, they don't address structural challenges, right? But they do provide psychological skills that people benefit from. And we've seen that just recently in a pilot study of people living with an incurable cancer, a terminal cancer. Now, we can't change anything structurally that's happening in these people's lives, but they've benefited from qualitatively and quantitatively from learning these skills, from changing their mindset, from learning psychological skills, practicing grounding exercises, these sorts of things. So it's a both and I get really frustrated when I see the practice, the bad, watered down, reductionistic,
Right.
monetized practice, reducing the perceived value of what is quite valuable and worth spending money on. Now,
Potentially.
but yes, exactly, potentially,
Potentially.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. So, any last
Mm.
comments from you, Todd? Otherwise, we've turned you into because we've turned you into the poster boy for pos psych when you have your own critique. So I think if we can spend the last half hour on starting with your critiques, Todd, and we can
Well,
wrap it up.
let's stick with this. So if you notice, I haven't used, I think, the word positive psychology, maybe accidentally, but I was purposely using the term well-being science
Sure.
because to expand it, because I think positive psychology has a connotation of there are leaders in the field and really the name should never matter. Like the construct shouldn't matter. It's basically like what accounts for the most variance in the thing that we believe is important that goes in there. But two things based on what you guys were talking about before. So one is iatrogenic effects, that these things can harm people. So I don't know the data on in the workplace. All I know is the number of people who report at Deloitte, at Apple, at Microsoft, and just talk about how terrible some of these in schools that these workshops are. But let's just take the world of mindfulness for a second. We know there's this concept of relaxation induced anxiety where there are certain people, I don't know what the percentage is, I think it's around 10 to 15%, who have basically it induces more anxiety of having these mindfulness and meditation based interventions than they do. So
Mm.
knowing this, and this is the beauty for me, is like I'm basically defending science. Like the beauty of the science is, how do you not think that there is a similar subgroup of people that's having some adverse reaction to the thing that you're exposing to? So,
Mm.
Matthew, you talked about how in your intervention that you can't change structural supports. I disagree. I think you can. I think that third marshmallow study from last week actually just, there's thousands of studies that are in this territory, which is like your
Mm.
social system can be messed with, especially in an organization, especially in a family that happens there, but it's messy. So, to what Ari's point is, in the real world, where you're interested in how someone gets out of bed, how someone deals with existential despair, and then how someone decides to have their dinner arranged together with or without kids and romantic partners and friends, in that real world, how does this stuff actually operate? And in that case, to understand people in the wild, you're going to have to kind of get a grasp of their structural system. Now, these interventions, often in the workplace and the school, they are assuming that they are constant. Got kids in class, there's an adult in the room. You've got teams in an organization and certain departments, and that's your organization, and we're just going to roll this out as if everyone is equal and just a constant that happens there. What I'm saying is you need to kind of actually do some really nice qualitative examinations, Ari's term of like just slow thinking of like, hey, how screwed up is this system that we're going to try to roll this thing in the first place? Because when this is done in the laboratory, all things are tried to help equal. In the real world, can Jessica sit next to Jonathan if Jesse ends up being in the room? Like, if it ends up being if June is there, are people gossiping more often? And so that people are really like distracted and there's actually like a lot less social integration among all the people that are here. All that stuff you're not going to find in the questionnaire. You're not going to find like in the intervention. You have to actually like observe like what is this little
Right.
zoological thing that I'm trying to like get myself involved in here. And I think when I see a lot of the things in place, we skip all these initial stages. And the thing is
Yeah.
if you want something to work, you have to be humble enough to understand that you don't know what the system is like. And so every friendship group is different in some way. All males don't talk the same way on text. All women don't talk the same way on text. Doesn't
Mm.
matter how many romantic comedies that you watch that happens there. They're different, like in terms of You can even use fractions, so like percentage of banter, percentage of intellectual conversation, percentage of talking about yourself, talking about other people, talking about emotions, talking about thoughts, talking about like nostalgic events happen there. Those fractions are different for every group. Knowing that first allows you to improve any social or psychological intervention. And I would strongly encourage people to ask really sophisticated questions, whether you're studying them or whether you're more on, kind of have like an RE in your brain and like you're kind of like thinking about like, I want to understand something. Ask more sophisticated questions. So your question shouldn't be, is self-compassion related to positive emotions? Like, is a good thing related to another good thing? Your question should be, if you have a room full of people where there is a little bit less trust because there was a betrayal 3 years ago where someone actually ratted on someone first and made a false accusation that wasn't true, and it's still all the same people are still part of that team structure right now. How will self-compassion work
Yeah.
in that group, right?
Yeah.
So ask the sophisticated question, stop asking the mundane questions that don't lead to anything important, because then Ari gets to say as many times as possible, like, this is useless science. And if you open up a typical scientific journal, large proportion of that is
A
that
lot of it.
basically a lot of it is curiosity related to happiness, is forgiveness related to mindfulness, is gratitude related to, what's the metacognitive awareness, like, are good things related to good things. And I would strongly encourage anyone listening is like, if that's all your question is, choose a riskier question and a riskier hypothesis.
Yeah, I'll just briefly respond there. Fantastic music to my ears, Todd. I think, but maybe we're jumping the gun a little bit in terms of where PodPsych needs to go. But I think if we see more of that kind of research, I'd be very happy. So more qualitative research, but not just qualitative, but more potentially action research, grounded th theory approaches. So really working with the context, the social context of the study group. That is so, 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 so important. You just don't get to probe. You don't get to find out all that nuance and that information with a questionnaire. You get a little bit deeper, I suppose, with focus groups and stuff like that. So, but I think, yeah, I think that deeper questioning, you need that curiosity. Um, and you need to be willing to ask those difficult questions and it's complicated. Just like you said, Todd, you've got, one context, you've got right, okay, an intervention works really well for some reason, but in another, all right, there's all this history about this in-group that have been fighting for some years, or they've scapegoated like one or two of the, of the class, and there's this kind of trauma and history, and nobody talks about it. You know what I mean? Nobody, so, but it's all in the background still. That's really, really interesting, and I think if we want good, effective, ethical interventions, that's the direction we need to go. My worry with the more data, better science approach is that the obvious impetus is that pretty much, obviously in the thinking about it in the context of the developments in technology, of biomonitoring, of surveillance, of more and more intrusive kind of interventions from government and employers, you can see how that would lead potentially to extremely intrusive environments in public policy or in corporations. So yeah, but there are ethical problems, I would say. You know what I mean? So, but yes, I think where we are at the moment, I think that's probably the best what we can do is get down in the ground, get dirty, get our hands dirty.
Yeah, you left a cool breadcrumb before that I didn't respond to, where you said, sort of to some degree, don't let me put words in your mouth, that maybe there's a questionable ethics of measuring kids' psychological strengths in a
Right,
school system.
right.
Because what if you're low on everything, right? Are you
Yeah.
prepared ahead of time? Like, what do you do with that? Like, do you like if were you planning to give them feedback? Are you gonna lie? That's has ethics. Are you not gonna lie? That has ethics. Are you when they get exposed to the fact that they are the lowest scorer in the room? That is ethics. So, for all of the interventions that are done in the schools, I haven't, and all the talks that I've sat through and all of the articles that I've read, I have never heard anyone talk about this. And that's kind of mind-blowing. And then just take the same exact kind of ethical kind of quandaries and now talk about the workplace. It's
Mhm.
not different because you're adults, because adults are often just like big kids.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I mean, I just have to just interrupt and say this conversation has been exactly what I hoped it would be. So I appreciate both of you. We've got maybe 10 minutes left. So well, I'm just wondering, we had a couple of questions come through from people online, and in general, I think like Annalise put through like three, you could do three theses on her three questions that she put through. So thank you, Annalise. But I actually think we've covered most of them, to be honest, like this difference between qualitative and quantitative. How do
Mm.
we sort of like open up our blind spots? And she had another question about ethics. So I think we've actually covered off. So she's anticipated this conversation very well.
Mm.
Paul Tupavea had a really interesting question, which was kind of the next wave of positive psychology, and he basically said, why should we write it? I think it's really funny that PodPsych does have this really strange, we're already onto like our third wave, or now they're talking about our fourth wave or something, and it's like it's been 20 years and we're into four waves already. Like is an ACT like the second wave of clinical psychology? They have like slower waves somehow. We have quick waves, which maybe speaks to this issue. But it's like, where do we go from here, basically? So, I think, Todd, you've made a really nice point around, this depression tidal wave. I'm going to keep going with some more wave analogies. This depression tidal wave is coming. Where do we look for solutions? Not necessarily interventions, but where do we look for solutions? And I think to Paul's point, like, there's a lot of practitioners who would be maybe feeling disillusioned after this conversation. This idea that, I'm doing the best I can with the resources that I have available to me. I want to do good. And maybe I'm not having the effect that I was hoping that I would. And I think maybe that's where Paul comes from. Why should I buy into this stuff?
Yeah.
And the
I
second part of his
mean,
question was, sorry, Todd. The second part
oh
was,
no.
what's the pathway to a more widely accepted well-being science? Because I think for all the reasons that we've described today, there is this a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth.
You mind if I grab this first? Just
Yeah,
because I've
please.
always
Yeah,
had
yeah.
such a big issue. There should be no waves whatsoever. Like the idea of arbitrary punctuations and the evolution of the field is just absurd. I mean, as soon as wave three came out and it said it was the integrating the negative and the positive, I was like, have you any of you read Carl Jung before? I mean, that was the origin of Robert and I's interest in the upside of your dark side. That was the origin of Paul Wong, such an amazing character. Like his work that happened. I know he got sucked into the marketing of calling it the third wave of positive psychology. I get it. Like he was always upset that as um as a Chinese researcher that he was as sort of the examples I was describing before, he was left out of the room. And so
Yeah.
if you understand the autobiography of Paul Wong, you understand why he created this thing called the third wave of positive psychology. He wasn't invited by Seligman. He wasn't invited by Csikszentmihalyi. He wasn't invited by Chris Peterson. He wasn't invited by Ed Dieter. He was on the outskirts. He felt very rejected and ostracized. So this was his way of saying, hey, like I think about these things too. Like I want a piece of the kingdom. And in honor of him, I'm going to say, let's get rid of all the waves because it's been a constant evolution and de-evolution constantly, and it's not clear. And it makes it seem like for Paul, the person who asked this question, makes it seem like you have to get a new thing. You have to get a new certification. You have to get new
Mm.
training. You have to get like this new constructs in there. And I'm saying, no,
Mm.
just listen to some of the specifics we're saying. Is like you don't have to learn anything new. You just have to approach the people you're interacting with and the ways you're trying to intervene a little bit differently. And maybe I'm giving permission to deviate from me and the other people that are writing the books and the articles and saying, most of those studies are this is what works on average. This is the average person that's high in curiosity. This is the average person that's high in purpose in terms of related to life longevity. If you look at the error bars, you'll see that there's a lot of people with strong purpose in life who died young. Well, get curious, as Ari said, like what's their story? Is there a pattern that's in there? You don't need to level up in wave 3 and 4 because there should be no wave in 3 and 4. And if I'm still alive and kicking, I'm gonna push against wave 4, 5, and 6 as people try to market themselves because it makes people feel like new is better and I've got to grab this new thing. And I would say be great at your craft. Don't worry about the new or latest thing. What accounts for the most variance and explaining important outcomes? That's what you want to focus on, even if it was made in 1967.
Amazing.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
I was for another reason reading that first book. I mean, this is a talk about people who were kicked out of the kingdom or whatever you said to close the gates. Like and Paul Wong has been a guest on the show, and another person I think obviously Corey Keyes, who I've probably talked about on every episode of this show. The first book that he and Jonathan Haidt edited together, you read this
Flourishing.
stuff, Flourishing, right? And then 10 years later another book comes out called Flourish. Like there's a lot of questions there. But anyway, um, you read it and you go like, oh, all these ideas that we've like arrived at 25 years later about, we're so preoccupied with positive and everything's good. These first edited chapters talk about all these things. It's already been said. Like if you read, we're a shell of where those first chapters actually took us. They already have all these ideas of here's what we mean by positive. We don't mean, you know,
Yeah.
airy fairy, everything's good. It doesn't mean any of those things. And they outlined it, but no one read that. Well,
Yep.
or we forgot about
They all
it, to your
focus
point,
on,
Todd.
yeah.
So,
Mm.
you know, I don't know. I don't know where to go from here. Obviously, the IPA conference is coming up soon. I don't know. It seems like we need to just spend a day at the pub. So anyone who's listening to this who's at IPA, it could be a conference day, it could be a day before, a day after. I don't want to be insensitive to people's time at the conference, but we just need to get to the bottom of this. I don't know where to from here. Eri, Todd.
And I think I'm delighted to hear Todd talking about Paul Wong because he's one of those kind of he certainly I met Paul Wong a couple of times, and he's a deeply profound human being, a lovely soul, and obviously slightly injured and hurt by the way he was kind of sidelined and marginalized. In but you are right, Todd, that this was really spoken about back with Carl Jung, this sort of yin yang idea, the concept of and all the rest of it. Obviously, Jung had his own vocabulary and approach, which is different to Paul Wong's, because Paul Wong is kind of methodologically within the positive psychological movement. So it is different in that sense. But I'm really, really delighted that you mentioned someone like Paul. I think he's fantastic. For the second wave, but I'd also agree with this whole idea of waves. I mean, the latest wave is the philosophical health, and things like that, certifications and all this sort of stuff. And you get all of these different fads and things, and I think that waters down the depth of the movement. The movement is, broadly speaking, a lot rich, like you said, Matt, a lot richer than we recognize. There's a lot of good, rich material in there, in the older papers, particularly. Um, and so we've got to recognize its breadth and its depth. It is there. I think the implementation problem is probably the biggest issue, but again, if we just zone out a little bit and recognize that actually, the pos psych, even I don't know, maybe you can't conflate the two. Well-being science, maybe they are different things. I don't know. I'd see them broadly the same thing. Maybe different focuses slightly. But it's still within the kind of science is all paradigm, and I think this is problematic epistemologically and ethically as well. So I think for me, for the movement to become ever richer, we need to start with philosophy. We need to start with thinking, and it's a slow thinking process. It's and all that means is matching up empirical researchers with philosophers. I mean, not all philosophers are the same, by the way, because there's a lot of complexity and nuance in philosophy. But with an analytic philosopher, with someone who's done conceptual work, marry them up together, and then you could get like get I mean, they try it at Harvard. They've got resident philosophers at Harvard. It doesn't. I mean, with all due respect to Harvard, because I'm friends with a lot of those guys, but it often doesn't translate. The richness, the philosophical richness doesn't translate. And so yeah, so I think we need more philosophy in the science field, and a recognition of the limitations of science.
Mhm.
And that will produce good quality research in the future. But that needs some big voices to say that. And I'm not sure we're hearing the big voices say that. The big voices tend to, still promote the old paradigm, basically. So that's, I think, an issue.
Mm. And I guess not to confuse what you're talking about, slow thinking with inaction, right? Because I think there are lots of practical things that can be happening right now. All right, sometimes it's delivered in an insensitive way. I think I agree with that, obviously. But what you're not saying like down tools. Let's not do anything to do with the promotion of mental health right now. Um,
No, I mean, it depends. It's a big question. I mean, it depends what you mean. If you're talking about, you know, teachers don't need to wait, do they, to know that they need to intervene, with a child that's in distress. I mean, or a child that's struggling with their coursework, for example. So you don't need to wait for science, you just need good values. So you need, and you can do practice-led um, stuff as well. So it's the practice is the excellence in the practice is driving research, So it's the other way around almost, rather than research-led evidence-based practice, you've got practice-based research. So, that I think is it, but then again, it's only as good as the people doing it.
yeah, and
So that
probably who gets to define good values as well as the other side of it.
so it's complex, it's tricky. It's very, very
Yeah.
tricky. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Todd, wrap us up. Anything left from yourself?
This is a great, I mean, these are the conversations people should be having. I think people have to start questioning their fiefdoms, and I don't see it enough. I mean, there's a reason that I don't speak at the conferences because they don't like me because I point out when the emperor's not wearing their underwear, and they don't like that. The thing is we've got too much research on constructive dissent to create a field that shields itself from constructive dissent. It can evolve quicker. It can be making a bigger impact if you allow true diverse voices. I mean, don't say you like diversity, actually let diverse voices in. And that means you bring in Ari who disagrees with you on some things, and you bring in me who disagrees with you on some things, and you bring in like people who like if the diverse voice agrees with everything you're saying and nods their head and asks for signatures on your books and asks for photos with you, then guess what? No matter what they look like, you didn't get a diverse voice. Bring them in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would like to just raise Sarah Willen's name here because she's impressed me a lot with her writing. There are voices like that far and few between, and she's not even, within that sort of field. You know what I mean? I think she's an anthropologist, so but she's talking about, the issues in positive psych. So yeah, bring in those dissident voices and just engage with them,
Mm.
just engage. It's all about dialogue, remembering that it's the sort of creature that we are. It's the sort of being that we need. We can't just all work it out in our heads. We're built almost to be interdependent.
Yeah.
So
And,
we have to have that kind of toing and froing.
and this is the question for me is the pace of this conversation, right? Because, I've really enjoyed coming across Sarah Willen's stuff myself recently, and I'm really looking forward. I think they've just did conducted like
Just published, yeah.
long form interviews with like 100 and something people asking them what does it mean to flourish in your life. Like that's going to be really rich
Mm.
and probably look nothing like the models that we've come up with, right? From and not just like it'll look different, but there'll be relative weakness and strengths, whatever. But, so she's had this back and forth with Tyler Vanderweel from Harvard. I
Yeah.
think quite constructive, but it's like, all right, the first paper comes out in 2022 around critiques. The response comes out in 23. The response to the response comes out in 25. Very well thought out arguments, disagreements, agreements, whatever, very productive. I haven't seen really anyone talk about this, but maybe I just missed these conversations, but that's just too slow. I think they could have, if, that's where I guess I'm going to spruik this podcast format for this conversation. I think we, Eri and Todd could have gone to war in academic writing, or also just totally ignored each other, or just totally missed each other. That's the other side of it, because it's just too big to keep on top of things. I don't know. I want to hear from people, like, how do we have more of these conversations? More than happy. I get up early to talk to Americans. I stay up late to talk to Europeans, and everyone else in every other time zone. There's obviously more parts of the world than that. I'm happy to keep doing this. I just want these conversations. I think this has been a very fruitful conversation. So I appreciate both of your time.
No, thank you. Anytime. I like being around people smarter than me. So this is always fun.
Yeah. When you find them, let me know. All right. Awesome. What are you guys up to today? What's the rest of the day look like?
Well, I got a jet. I got to pick up my kid from volleyball right now.
Yeah, it's now almost 10:30, so not
Oh, wow.
not a lot is going to be happening here. I'll just sort of wind down with a nice hot cup of cocoa, something like that.
That was awesome. Ari, you are awesome. Matt, you're awesome. I love this. I cannot wait for people to listen to this. This was better than I could have even imagined. This is great.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And thank you both, patience in tech difficulties and reschedules and calendars and stuff. So awesome. Thank you both so much.
Yeah. All right. We'll talk soon. See you guys.
Thanks, Todd. Bye.
Todd, thank you.